The land whispered secrets on the outskirts of Hollow Creek, Texas, where the Johnson homestead stood defiant against time. In 1878, the sprawling farmhouse with its weathered, clapboard and crooked chimney had become a fixture of local lore, not for its architectural grace, but for what lay hidden within its walls. Thomas Johnson arrived in the county 5 years prior with his young wife, Margaret, purchasing nearly 80 acres of hardscrabble land that others had deemed too stubborn to farm. The couple, childless when they arrived, worked the unforgiving soil with relentless determination. Within months of settling, Margaret's belly swelled with child. The news traveled through the scattered community like wildfire. The Johnsons would have their firstborn. The pregnancy brought a strange transformation to the farmhouse. Thomas began making peculiar modifications, spending long nights hammering and sawing, the lantern light visible from the road until dawn. Neighbors who called to offer congratulations noted the odd renovations, sections of walls being removed and rebuilt, new plaster mixed in unusual quantities. "Just preparing a proper home for the young one," Thomas would say, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Margaret, once vibrant and sociable, withdrew from community gatherings. When questioned by concerned friends, she would simply place a protective hand over her belly and whisper, "The child must be properly housed." On a bitterly cold February night, Dr. Samuel Thorne was summoned to the Johnson farm. The birth was difficult. Margaret's screams echoed across the frost-covered fields. As dawn broke, the doctor emerged ashen-faced, clutching his medical bag with white knuckles. "A healthy boy," he reported to the small gathering of neighbors who had come to help. "But I'd advise against disturbing the family for a while. Mrs. Johnson needs rest." 3 days passed before anyone saw Thomas again. When he appeared in town for supplies, his face bore the exhausted relief of a new father. Yet something in his demeanor troubled those who spoke with him, a feverish intensity in his eyes, a trembling in his hands. "How's the child, Thomas?" asked Elijah Wade, the general store proprietor. "Safe," Thomas replied. "Finally safe where nothing can touch him." The subsequent weeks brought disturbing reports from those passing the Johnson property. No baby's cries could be heard. No clothes hung on the line, no cradle was visible through the windows. When the minister's wife brought a handmade quilt for the infant, Margaret accepted it with tears, but wouldn't allow her past the front door. "The baby's sleeping," she insisted, "in his special place." By summer, rumors circulated through Hollow Creek. Dr. Thorne, bound by his oath, refused to speak of what he had witnessed that February night. But his hands trembled whenever the Johnson baby was mentioned, and he had taken to drinking heavily, something entirely out of character for the previously temperate man. Then came the whispers of sounds emanating from the Johnson house. Not the expected cries of an infant, but something altogether different, something that made the blood run cold in those who heard it. A sound like scratching, faint but persistent, coming from within the very walls themselves. By the fall of 1879, Margaret Johnson was with child again. Her first pregnancy had transformed her from a robust woman into a hollow-eyed shadow, and this second one seemed to be completing the process. She no longer ventured into town, and the few who glimpsed her through the farmhouse windows described a woman aged beyond her years, muttering constantly to the walls. Thomas had become equally reclusive, though necessity occasionally drove him to town for supplies. On these rare appearances, townsfolk noted the dirt perpetually embedded beneath his fingernails and the plaster dust that clung to his clothes, regardless of the season. His once friendly demeanor had calcified into something brittle and defensive. "You've another child coming," Elijah Wade remarked during one such visit. "Must be preparing another room, eh?" Thomas's hand froze midway through counting coins. "Not a room," he corrected, his voice distant. "A place. A sacred place where my children can remain pure." Sheriff Caleb Matthews had heard enough disturbing reports to warrant a visit to the Johnson farm. A veteran of the recent war, Matthews was not a man easily unnerved, yet something about the farmhouse raised the hairs on the back of his neck as he approached. Thomas greeted him on the porch, body positioned to block the entrance. Behind him, the sheriff caught a glimpse of Margaret, heavily pregnant, running her hands lovingly across a section of freshly plastered wall. "Folks in town are concerned," Matthews stated plainly. "No one's seen your firstborn. There's talk." "My son is where he belongs," Thomas replied, his jaw set in stubborn lines. "Would you like me to show you his birth record?" The doctor signed it proper. "I'd prefer to see the boy himself." Thomas's eyes hardened. "He's sleeping. Let's not disturb him." Matthews left unsatisfied, but without legal cause to press further. 2 days later, Dr. Thorne was found dead in his office, an empty bottle of laudanum beside him and a half-written letter on his desk. The letter, addressed to the sheriff, contained only one coherent line before dissolving into illegible scrawl. "What I witnessed in the Johnson house was an abomination against God and nature. In December, as a blue norther swept across the county, Margaret gave birth to a girl. This time, there was no doctor present. Only Thomas and his wife, alone in the farmhouse, as the temperature plummeted and the wind howled like a mourner. 3 days later, Thomas appeared at Elijah Wade's store as the owner was closing for the evening. "Need plaster," Thomas said, his voice ragged from exhaustion. "And lime, more than usual." Elijah, troubled by the man's appearance and the rumors swirling through town, hesitated. "Your little girl doing well?" Thomas's face contorted into what might have been a smile. "She will never know pain or sin or corruption," he whispered. "She'll remain perfect forever, just as God intended." That night, as the storm intensified, 13-year-old Jesse Wade, son of the store owner, claimed to have seen Thomas in the family cemetery behind the farmhouse, digging in the frozen ground by lantern light. When asked what he was burying, Jesse's reply chilled his father. "Nothing, Pa. He wasn't putting something in. He was taking something out." The following Sunday, for the first time since their arrival, the Johnsons attended church. They sat rigid in the back pew, Margaret's face blank beneath her bonnet, Thomas clutching a Bible with white-knuckled intensity. During the sermon on Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, witnesses would later recall Thomas nodding with unsettling enthusiasm, whispering, "Yes, yes," as the preacher described the binding of the child. After the service, several women approached Margaret, offering congratulations on the new baby. Her response would be repeated around dinner tables for weeks to come. "My children are within the walls," she said, her voice eerily serene, "where the angels sealed them away from wickedness." Spring brought unprecedented rains to Hollow Creek in 1880, turning the hard Texas soil to mud and swelling the creek beyond its banks. The Johnson farmhouse, situated on higher ground, remained dry while other properties suffered. "God protects the righteous," Thomas proclaimed during one of his increasingly erratic visits to town. By this time, the Johnsons had become objects of fearful fascination. Children dared each other to approach the property line. Adults crossed to the opposite side of the street when Thomas appeared, yet no one directly confronted what many had come to suspect. Something unnatural was occurring behind those weathered walls. Margaret was pregnant again, her third child in as many years. Her body, visibly depleted, moved with the fragile caution of shattered glass, barely held together. During a rare moment alone at the general store, Widow Abernathy, a woman known for her direct manner, grasped Margaret's wrist. "Let us help you, child," she whispered urgently. "Whatever hold he has on you, whatever madness possesses your home, it isn't too late." For a moment something sparked in Margaret's vacant eyes. Recognition, perhaps even desperation. But it guttered out just as quickly, replaced by the same distant serenity that had become her constant expression. "My children are safe," she murmured. "Safe in the embrace of the house. Thomas says it's the only way to ensure their salvation." The widow reported this exchange to Sheriff Matthews, who had been building a case for intervention despite the lack of concrete evidence. The discovery made by two boys fishing along the creek after the floodwaters receded provided the impetus he needed. What they initially thought was a doll's arm protruding from the muddy bank turned out to be something far more disturbing. Small human remains, partially decomposed, that appeared to have been washed downstream from the direction of the Johnson property. The bones showed signs of having been previously buried, then exhumed. Matthews assembled a small group of deputies and concerned citizens, including Elijah Wade and the new town doctor, William Fraser. As they approached the farmhouse on a sweltering June afternoon, an unnatural silence enveloped the property. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to die as they neared. Thomas met them on the porch, a shotgun cradled in his arms. Behind him, through the open door, they could see Margaret seated in a rocking chair, her swollen belly contrasting sharply with her skeletal frame. Her hands moved continuously, caressing the wall beside her. "You're trespassing," Thomas stated flatly. Matthews stepped forward. "We've found remains, Johnson, a child's remains, washed down from your property." For the first time, Thomas's composure cracked. "Impossible," he hissed. "They're safe inside, protected. I've sealed them away from corruption." "I need to see your children," Matthews insisted. "Now." "You can't," Margaret called from inside, her voice strangely melodic. "They're part of the house now, part of the sanctified walls." What happened next would be recounted differently by various witnesses. Some claimed Thomas raised his shotgun. Others said he simply turned to flee inside. What is certain is that in the chaos that followed, a shot was fired. Thomas fell, blood blooming across his chest. As Matthews and the others rushed forward, a terrible wailing erupted, not from Margaret, who remained eerily calm in her rocking chair, but from the walls themselves. A chorus of muffled cries that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the house. "Do you hear them?" Margaret smiled, stroking her belly with one hand and the wall with the other. "They're waking up. They always wake when their father works on their chambers." The horror of what they discovered inside the Johnson farmhouse would haunt Hollow Creek for generations. Behind sections of recently plastered wall, the search party found small cavities, spaces barely large enough to contain the tiny bodies that had been sealed within them. Dr. Fraser, barely controlling his revulsion, confirmed what many had already guessed. "They were placed here alive," he stated, his professional demeanor cracking. "The children were still living when they were entombed." The first cavity, hidden behind a parlor wall, contained the remains of a male infant approximately 18 months old. The second space, freshly plastered in a bedroom wall, held a female child of about 6 months. Both bodies showed signs of malnourishment, but no other trauma. Most disturbing were the scratch marks on the inside of the plaster, evidence of desperate, futile attempts to escape. Margaret, now in custody and separated from the house she refused to leave willingly, spoke with unsettling clarity about what she and Thomas had done. "The world is sin," she explained to Sheriff Matthews during her initial questioning. "Thomas saw it clearly after the war. What men do to one another, the corruption that touches everything. Our children needed protection from that taint." "By sealing them in the walls?" Matthews asked incredulously. Margaret's eyes shone with fervent belief. "The prophets sealed their most sacred texts in walls to preserve them from destruction. Thomas said our children were our sacred vessels, untainted by the world. The walls would protect their purity until Judgment Day." Further investigation of the property revealed more horrors. In the family plot behind the house, they found evidence of multiple small graves that had been recently disturbed. According to Margaret's rambling confession, Thomas had exhumed these remains, children from their previous residence in Louisiana, to bring them to the sanctuary of the Hollow Creek house. "The other house wasn't strong enough," she explained. "The walls were too thin. Thomas said this house had been waiting for us, calling to us." Most disturbing was the discovery in the root cellar. Jars of preserved umbilical cords, tiny fingernail clippings, and locks of infant hair, each meticulously labeled with names and dates stretching back 5 years before their arrival in Texas. The evidence suggested the Johnsons had sealed at least 3 other children in the walls of their previous home. As news of the discoveries spread, a Baptist minister from a neighboring county came forward with a troubling account. He recalled Thomas Johnson, then using the name Thomas Jensen, attending revival meetings years earlier, becoming obsessed with a fiery sermon on child purity and spiritual corruption. He latched onto the idea that children who died before the age of reason were guaranteed salvation, the minister explained, but he twisted it, perverted it, started asking strange questions about preservation of innocence and whether a child isolated from all worldly influence would remain in a state of grace. Margaret, whose pregnancy continued despite her incarceration, maintained an eerie serenity throughout the investigation. She spoke constantly to her unborn child, promising it would join the others in the sacred walls soon. Dr. Fraser, concerned for both the mother's mental state and the welfare of the unborn child, recommended Margaret be transferred to the state asylum in Austin. The night before the scheduled transfer, however, Elijah Wade's son Jesse reported seeing a figure resembling Thomas Johnson, despite the man's confirmed death, walking the road toward the abandoned farmhouse. The following morning, Margaret's cell was found empty, the locks undisturbed, as if she had simply passed through the walls. A frantic search of the county yielded no trace of the pregnant woman. 3 days later, smoke was spotted rising from the chimney of the Johnson farmhouse, which had stood empty since the discoveries. Sheriff Matthews led an armed group to investigate, finding the front door ajar and fresh footprints in the dust. Inside, they discovered a section of wall newly plastered. As they approached, the plaster bulged outward slightly, as if something behind it was pressing to get out. And from within the wall came a sound that froze their blood, not the cry of a newborn, but something older, something filled with hunger and malice. Something that had learned patience in the dark embrace of the walls. The decision to burn the Johnson farmhouse came not from official channels, but from the collective will of Hollow Creek's citizens. After what was discovered behind the freshly plastered wall, a sight so disturbing that Sheriff Matthews refused to describe it in his official report, there seemed no other recourse. "That place isn't just tainted by human evil," Reverend Parker declared to the assembled townspeople. "Something older has taken root there, something that fed on what the Johnsons did." The fire, set at dusk on a windless evening, should have reduced the structure to ash by morning. Instead, witnesses reported that the flames seemed to struggle against the house itself, as if the building actively resisted destruction. More disturbing were the sounds that emanated from within the burning structure. Not the expected crackle and roar of fire-consuming wood, but shrieks that seemed almost human, rising and falling in agonized chorus. By dawn, only a blackened shell remained, the stone foundation and chimneys standing like accusing fingers against the Texas sky. Margaret Johnson was never found, alive or dead. Some claimed she had returned to the house to die with her sealed children. Others insisted she had fled west, carrying her unnatural beliefs to new territory. The land remained vacant for nearly a decade, no local willing to claim it despite its fertility. Eventually, the county seized the property for unpaid taxes, selling it at auction to a cattle baron from San Antonio who had no knowledge of its history. The new owner, George Huntington, dispatched workers to clear the burned ruins and erect a line shack for his cowhands. The first structure collapsed during construction, its support beams snapping simultaneously, despite being newly cut from sound timber. The second attempt fared no better. Overnight, the partially completed walls twisted inward as if crushed by an enormous hand. After the third failure, during which 2 workers suffered inexplicable, crushing injuries despite nothing visibly falling on them, Huntington abandoned his plans. "That land doesn't want to be built on," reported his foreman, a practical man not given to superstition. "It pushes back." In 1894, An unusually heavy rainstorm washed away portions of the remaining foundation, exposing something that brought the horrors of the Johnson family rushing back into public consciousness. Embedded within the very foundation stones of the house were small skeletal remains, evidence that Thomas Johnson's grotesque practice had extended beyond the walls to the very bedrock of the home. Examination of these remains by a medical examiner from Austin confirmed they belonged to at least 2 infants, both sealed within the foundation while still alive. More disturbing was the examiner's observation that the stones surrounding these remains showed signs of having been somehow altered, as if the stone itself had grown around the bodies, rather than the bodies being placed within prepared spaces. This discovery prompted a more thorough investigation of the property. Using divining rods and primitive-sounding techniques, investigators identified unusual densities throughout the soil where the house had stood. Excavation revealed a network of roots or root-like structures extending outward from the foundation in all directions, except they weren't plant matter. The material appears to be calcified human tissue, wrote the examining physician, as if human remains have somehow spread through the soil in a manner resembling plant growth. I confess I have no scientific explanation for this phenomenon. Local law quickly provided what science could not, a narrative that transformed the already horrific story of the Johnson family into something even darker. Old-timers recalled rumors that the land where Thomas built his house had been considered cursed by local indigenous peoples, who avoided it even before white settlers arrived. They spoke of an ancient belief that certain places hungered for life, drawing it in and consuming it. The house didn't corrupt the Johnsons, Widow Abernathy declared to anyone who would listen. The land corrupted the house, and the house corrupted them. It was hungry for young souls, and it found the perfect servants in Thomas and Margaret. Whether driven by superstition or legitimate caution, the county eventually declared the entire 80-acre plot unfit for habitation. Maps were redrawn to mark the area as county wetlands, despite its obvious aridity. Local children were forbidden from venturing near it, though this naturally made it an irresistible destination for the brave or foolhardy. Those who did venture onto the former Johnson property returned with identical descriptions of an unnatural silence, a feeling of being watched and, most disturbingly, the sensation of small hands reaching up from the soil, grasping at ankles and shoelaces. In the autumn of 1901, a peculiar individual arrived in Hollow Creek. Introducing himself as Professor Edgar Winthrop of the newly established Parapsychical Research Society in Boston, he took lodgings at the town's modest hotel and began asking pointed questions about the Johnson farmhouse and its grim history. Winthrop, tall, gaunt, with wire-rimmed spectacles that magnified his already unsettling pale blue eyes, presented himself as a scientific investigator of phenomena that challenge conventional explanation. Though initially met with suspicion, his academic credentials and formal demeanor eventually earned him a reluctant audience with Sheriff Matthews, now retired but still the primary living authority on the Johnson case. "I've studied similar incidents across the country," Winthrop explained as they sat on Matthew's porch. "Cases where human depravity seems to intersect with something older. Something that perhaps was waiting for precisely such an intersection." Matthews, grey-haired but still sharp-eyed, studied the professor warily. "You're suggesting the Johnsons were influenced by something on that land?" "I'm suggesting a symbiosis, Sheriff. A mutual feeding, if you will. The Johnsons brought their particular madness to that place, but the place itself was already hungry. It simply found in them the perfect mechanism to satisfy its appetites." Despite Matthew's warnings, Winthrop was determined to visit the abandoned property. No amount of description, he insisted, could substitute for direct observation. Reluctantly, Elijah Wade's son, Jesse, now a deputy himself, agreed to guide the professor to the property line, but refused to step onto the land. Winthrop spent 3 days camped at the edge of the Johnson acreage, making observations and taking soil samples. On the fourth morning, Jesse found the professor's camp deserted, a trail of footprints leading into the property toward the ruined foundation. Following at a careful distance, Jesse discovered Winthrop kneeling beside what remained of the house's foundation, frantically digging with bare hands in the hard soil. "Professor," Jesse called, "you shouldn't be here." When Winthrop turned, his face was transformed, not by fear, but by ecstatic revelation. "Can you hear them?" he asked, his voice trembling with excitement. "The walls between worlds are so thin here." "They're speaking!" Before Jesse could respond, the ground beneath Winthrop appeared to shift. To Jesse's horror, the professor began to sink, not as one would in quicksand, but as if the solid earth was somehow closing around him like a fist. Winthrop made no attempt to escape. Indeed, he spread his arms in what looked like welcome as the soil rose to his waist, then his chest. "They're calling me into the walls," were his last words before the earth closed over his head. By the time Jesse returned with help, there was no sign of the professor except for his abandoned equipment. The ground where Jesse had witnessed his disappearance was solid, showing no evidence of disturbance. Though they dug to a depth of 6 feet, no trace of Winthrop was found. The professor's notes, recovered from his camp, provided disturbing insights into his theories. He had documented similar cases across America, instances where buildings seemed to develop a malevolent consciousness after exposure to extreme human suffering or depravity. More troubling were his references to pre-Christian European practices of foundation sacrifices, where living beings, usually animals but sometimes children, were entombed in the foundations of important structures to feed the building and ensure its strength. The Johnson case represents a modern manifestation of an ancient understanding, Winthrop had written, that structures can be imbued with a form of life through sacrifice. What makes this case unique is the apparent reverse influence. The land itself seems to have encouraged the practice, as if it contained a dormant hunger that the Johnsons awakened and fed. The final pages of Winthrop's journal contained increasingly erratic entries, describing whispers emanating from the soil and dreams in which he was invited into the walls, where the children wait. The very last entry, dated the night before his disappearance, contained a single sentence: "I understand now, the walls are not a prison but a womb." In the wake of Winthrop's disappearance, county officials made a final effort to neutralize whatever malign influence lingered on the Johnson property. On the advice of several spiritual authorities, including a Catholic priest, a Comanche elder, and a voodoo practitioner brought in from New Orleans, they encircled the entire 80 acres with salt-infused concrete markers, each inscribed with symbols from various protective traditions. "We can't destroy it," the Comanche elder told them. "That hunger has taken root too deeply, but perhaps we can contain it, keep it from spreading." For a time it seemed to work. In the spring of 1925, nearly 50 years after the Johnson horrors, progress finally came to the isolated corner of Texas that contained Hollow Creek. The discovery of oil in neighboring counties brought surveyors and speculators streaming into the region, armed with maps and dreams of black gold. Hollow Creek, having dwindled to barely 100 residents, suddenly found itself strategically located near a proposed pipeline route. Land values soared overnight. Parcels that had been in the same families for generations changed hands rapidly, often at prices that seemed fantastical to the modest farmers and ranchers who had held them. Only one significant piece of land remained unclaimed and untested, the 80 acres once owned by the Johnsons. Though local memory of the specific horrors had faded somewhat, the property's reputation as cursed land persisted. The concrete markers surrounding it, now weathered and half buried in places, still served as warnings to stay away. Vernon Blackwood, owner of Blackwood Petroleum, was not a man easily deterred by local superstition. Having built his fortune by drilling where others feared to tread, He dismissed the warnings about the Johnson property with characteristic contempt. Fairy tales and ghost stories, he scoffed when informed of the land's history. The kind of nonsense that keeps simple folk poor while men of vision prosper. Using his considerable political connections, Blackwood acquired the Johnson acreage through a forced county auction. His geological surveys suggested it sat atop a potentially significant oil deposit, one that might extend beneath neighboring properties he had already purchased. Despite difficulties finding workers willing to set foot on the property, Blackwood established a drilling operation in the summer of 1926. The crew he assembled consisted largely of men from outside the region, unaware of the land's history. The few locals he managed to hire worked only during daylight hours and refused to remain on site after dusk. Progress was slow, plagued by equipment failures and accidents that defied explanation. Drill bits would inexplicably dull within hours. Support structures collapsed despite proper engineering. Most disturbing were the reports from workers who claimed to hear children's voices emanating from the boreholes, crying, pleading, sometimes singing fragmented lullabies. By August, Blackwood had lost nearly a third of his crew to resignations or suspicious accidents. Determined to maintain the operation, he moved his personal trailer onto the site, declaring he would oversee the work directly. His presence temporarily stemmed the tide of departures, though workers noted a gradual change in the petroleum magnate's demeanor. The once boisterous Blackwood grew quiet and introspective. He took to spending hours staring at the foundation remnants of the Johnson house, which had been uncovered during the initial site clearing. Workers reported hearing him engage in conversations with unseen entities, particularly at dusk, when shadows lengthened across the property. On September 14, 1926, the drilling operation finally struck oil, though oil proved an inadequate description for what emerged from the earth. Witnesses described a substance that resembled crude petroleum in consistency but was paler, almost flesh-colored, and seemed to move with purpose when collected in containers. More disturbing were the objects that came up with this substance. Tiny bones, fragments of cloth, and small personal items like buttons and hairpins, all dating from the late 1800s. Most unsettling was the temperature of the material, not the expected heat of something emerging from deep underground, but cold, corpse cold, as one worker described it. Blackwood, far from being disturbed by these anomalies, became obsessed with the strange flow. He ordered the drilling to continue deeper, dismissing the increasingly frantic warnings of his chief engineer that they were exceeding safe depths for their equipment. "It's calling to me," he reportedly told his foreman. "The wealth beneath this land isn't what I thought, but it's more valuable than I ever imagined." On September 17th, disaster struck. Without warning, the primary drilling apparatus collapsed, crashing through the temporary flooring that had been constructed around the borehole. 3 workers fell into the widening cavity, which seemed to expand with unnatural speed, consuming equipment and men alike. As survivors scrambled to escape the collapsing operation, they reported a horrifying sight. Vernon Blackwood, standing at the edge of the growing abyss, his arms outstretched as if in welcome. Witnesses claimed the strange pale fluid that had emerged from the well was rising up in tendrils, wrapping around Blackwood's body. "The children need a father," he was heard to say before stepping deliberately into the collapsing borehole. "The walls need new blood." By nightfall, nothing remained of Blackwood's operation except scattered equipment at the periphery of the property. The borehole and everything near it, including Blackwood and 5 workers, had vanished into a perfectly circular depression that rapidly filled with a substance resembling hardened plaster. County authorities, responding to reports of the disaster, found themselves facing a familiar horror. The depression, approximately 50 feet in diameter, had developed distinct architectural features overnight, angles and surfaces that suggested walls, doorways, and small alcoves, all composed of the same plaster-like material that contained visibly embedded human remains. "It's rebuilding itself," Jesse Wade, now county sheriff like his father before him, observed with grim recognition. "The house wants to return." After the Blackwood incident, state authorities finally intervened. The entire 80-acre property was declared a hazardous site, surrounded by barbed wire fencing and posted with warnings. Armed guards patrolled its perimeter for several years, though their primary function seemed to be keeping people out rather than containing whatever existed within. For decades, the Johnson property remained isolated, a forbidden zone in an otherwise rapidly developing region. Oil wealth transformed neighboring communities, but Hollow Creek itself dwindled further, as if the proximity to the tainted land stunted not just its growth, but its very will to exist. By the 1950s, only a handful of families remained in what had once been a promising frontier town. Among them were the descendants of Sheriff Matthews and the Wade family, self-appointed guardians of the community's institutional memory regarding the Johnson horror. Catherine Wade, Jesse's granddaughter and the town's unofficial historian, maintained meticulous records of the property and the strange occurrences associated with it. Though scientific interest in the site had waned after several university-sponsored investigations yielded inconclusive results, Catherine continued to document subtle changes in the landscape, most notably the gradual expansion of the plaster-like formation that had swallowed Blackwood's drilling operation. "It's growing," she reported to increasingly indifferent county officials, "not quickly, but steadily, like a coral reef building itself over decades." By 1957, the formation had indeed evolved into a structure with distinct architectural elements, a rough approximation of a house with walls and internal divisions clearly visible from aerial photographs. More disturbing was Catherine's documentation of its surface texture, which appeared to incorporate organic elements within its mineral composition. "The walls contain what appear to be partially preserved human remains," noted Dr. Lewis Harper, the last academic to study the site before government funding dried up completely. "Not just bones, but tissue that has undergone a transformation process resembling calcification. It's as if the human material is being converted into building material through some unknown biological or chemical process." In the summer of 1963, Catherine's monitoring revealed a troubling new development. Sounds emanating from the structure, not the vague whispers or crying that had been reported historically, but distinct voices engaged in what seemed like normal domestic conversations. Using primitive recording equipment, she captured fragments that chilled those few who bothered to listen, almost ready for another. "The walls need strengthening in the south corner. Children mustn't cry when they're being sealed." Most disturbing was a child's voice clearly calling Mama repeatedly, followed by a woman's gentle response. "Hush now. The walls will hold you safe." Catherine's increasingly urgent reports to authorities went unheeded until the spring of 1964, when 3 teenagers from a neighboring town disappeared after reportedly planning to spend a night in the haunted house on a dare. Search parties found no trace of the missing teens, though Catherine Wade insisted she had heard young voices added to the chorus emanating from the structure shortly after their disappearance. This incident finally prompted a comprehensive governmental response. Under the guise of environmental contamination, a convenient explanation given the site's history as an abandoned oil drilling operation, federal authorities seized control of the property. For several weeks, the area was swarming with personnel in hazardous material suits, conducting what appeared to be a thorough investigation of the structure and surrounding soil. Then, abruptly, they were gone. The property was redeclared a restricted federal zone, with new fencing, motion sensors, and surveillance cameras installed around its perimeter. No public statement was ever issued regarding their findings. Locals who questioned the operation were told simply that a containment protocol had been implemented and the site posed no further danger to the surrounding community. Catherine Wade, now elderly but still sharp, didn't believe a word of it. Through a network of contacts developed during her decades of research, she obtained fragments of the classified federal report. What she read confirmed her worst fears. The structure was indeed growing, incorporating any organic material it contacted into its composition through an unknown process that restructured matter at a molecular level. More terrifying was the report's conclusion that the structure appeared to be developing not just architectural complexity, but systemic functions, analogous to a living organism. Air samples from its interior revealed rhythmic fluctuations in carbon dioxide levels, suggesting a respiratory process. Thermal imaging detected heat patterns that circulated through the structure like a circulatory system. The entity presents as a hybrid form, read one partially redacted section, neither fully structural nor fully biological, but possessing characteristics of both. Of particular concern are indications of neural-like activity within the denser portions of its walls, suggesting some form of consciousness or information processing capability. The final pages of the report outlined the containment strategy, a series of deep trenches filled with specially formulated concrete designed to isolate the structure from the surrounding soil, preventing its further expansion. Regular monitoring would track any changes or attempts by the entity to breach this barrier. They're not trying to destroy it, Catherine told her small circle of confidants. They can't destroy it. They're just hoping to keep it sleeping, keep it contained. But the Johnsons woke something that had been dormant in that land for who knows how long. And now it's awake, it's growing, and it's hungry for more children to seal in its walls. In her final journal entry, dated November 1968, Catherine Wade wrote, "The mistake they make is thinking of it as a haunted house. It's not a house that became haunted. It's something ancient and hungry that takes the form of a house, because houses are where we bring our children, where we feel safe. The Johnsons didn't create this abomination. They merely gave it a template, a pattern to follow, and it will keep following that pattern, keep calling to those who might serve its needs, keep growing its walls to receive new offerings, because that's what it does, that's what it is, a hunger in the shape of a home." Catherine Wade disappeared the following day. Her home was found undisturbed, breakfast half-eaten on the table, as if she had simply walked away mid-meal. The only unusual element was a fine coating of plaster dust on the floor, leading from her front door out toward the road that passed near the restricted federal zone. In 1991, budget cuts and changing governmental priorities led to a reduction in surveillance at the Johnson property. The concrete containment barriers remained, but regular monitoring dwindled to quarterly inspections, then annual visits, and finally to automated sensor readings checked remotely by technicians who had no knowledge of what they were actually observing. By the turn of the millennium, the horror of the Johnson family had faded into local legend, a ghost story told around campfires, with details exaggerated or softened depending on the audience. Few remained who had any direct connection to the events or understood the true nature of what lay behind the government fencing. Among those few was Michael Wade, Catherine's great-nephew and the inheritor of her extensive research. Unlike his great-aunt, Michael approached the subject with academic detachment, viewing the family obsession with the Johnson property as an interesting anthropological case study in how communities process trauma through mythologizing. A professor of folklore at the University of Texas, Michael occasionally referenced the Johnson case in his lectures on regional legendary, presenting it as an example of how actual historical events can evolve into supernatural narratives. He considered Catherine's later journals, with their increasingly fantastical claims about a sentient growing structure, to be evidence of an elderly mind slipping into paranoid delusion. This perspective changed dramatically in October 2003, when Michael received a package from a retired federal employee named Douglas Reeves. The accompanying letter explained that Reeves had been part of the 1964 containment operation at the Johnson site and had recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer. "Before I die, someone needs to know what we found there," Reeves wrote. "The records have been buried or destroyed as part of some internal cleansing operation. I kept these copies against explicit orders. They need to be preserved." The enclosed documents included classified reports, soil analyses, and most disturbingly, photographic evidence that appeared to confirm Catherine Wade's most outlandish claims. Sequential aerial photographs from 1964 to 1989 showed the gradual evolution of the structure, its walls extending and reconfiguring in patterns that mimicked organic growth. Most shocking were the thermal images, which clearly showed heat signatures within the walls, not the diffuse patterns one would expect from decomposition or chemical reactions, but organized moving concentrations that resembled human forms. These heat signatures were particularly dense in sections of wall that protruded inward, forming the niches or alcoves that Catherine had described in her journals. A handwritten note from Reeves explained the government's ultimate decision: "We couldn't destroy it. Every attempt to demolish or dismantle sections of the structure resulted in rapid regeneration and, more disturbingly, a defensive response. After 3 personnel were lost, absorbed into the walls while attempting to extract samples, the decision was made to contain rather than confront." Michael's academic skepticism crumbled in the face of this evidence. Visiting the site personally, he found the government fencing in disrepair, the warning signs faded and illegible. Using Reeves' access codes, he was able to retrieve data from the automated monitoring systems, confirming his worst fears. The containment barriers had failed in multiple locations, and the structure was once again expanding. More alarming was evidence that the entity had adapted to the constraints placed upon it. Rather than growing outward above ground, where such expansion would be visible, it had extended its influence downward and outward beneath the soil, bypassing the concrete barriers entirely. "It's not just growing physically," Michael wrote in the journal he had begun keeping in Catherine's tradition. "It's evolving strategies, learning." Through careful research and discreet inquiries, Michael discovered a disturbing pattern of disappearances in the region over the preceding decades. Not just the expected thrill-seekers drawn to the site's reputation, but vulnerable individuals from surrounding communities, runaways, foster children, the overlooked and forgotten. Most troubling was his discovery that certain individuals appeared to be acting as agents or servants of the entity, luring victims to the property. These weren't random opportunists, but people who had come into contact with the site and been somehow changed by the experience, as if infected by its purpose. In May 2004, Michael identified one such individual, Raymond Carter, a maintenance worker at a youth shelter in a neighboring county, who had disappeared along with 3 teenage residents. Department of Transportation records revealed Carter had been part of a crew assigned to repair the access road near the Johnson property 2 years earlier. Tracking Carter through credit card transactions, Michael followed him to an abandoned gas station 30 miles from the Johnson site. There, he discovered Carter living with the missing teenagers, who appeared to be in a state of drug-induced compliance. The walls of the station were covered with elaborate chalk drawings depicting a house with alcoves in its walls, each containing a small figure. "They need to be prepared," Carter explained when confronted, his eyes feverish but his manner eerily calm. "Cleansed, the house is ready for new children, the walls are hungry." In Carter's possession, Michael found a jar containing a grayish substance that subsequent analysis revealed to be composed primarily of calcium compounds mixed with organic material sharing DNA markers, with samples taken from the Johnson site decades earlier. Carter had been feeding this substance to the teenagers, apparently as part of some preparatory ritual. Michael's attempts to alert authorities were met with bureaucratic indifference or active obstruction. Those officials who didn't dismiss him as a crank seemed strangely reluctant to investigate the Johnson property or its possible connection to the disappearances. "There's something wrong with how people respond when I bring this up," he noted in his journal. "It's not just disbelief or skepticism. It's as if they physically can't focus on what I'm saying. Their attention slides away, or they suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. I'm starting to think the entity's influence extends beyond its physical boundaries, some kind of psychic field that discourages attention or intervention." Realizing he was on his own, Michael began documenting everything meticulously, creating multiple copies of his findings and distributing them to trusted colleagues with instructions to publish should anything happen to him. He also began researching methods to destroy the entity, consulting esoteric sources that his academic training had taught him to dismiss, but which now seemed to offer the only useful perspectives on what he was facing. "It needs to be starved," he concluded after months of research. Whatever the Johnsons awakened, whatever template they provided it, the entity requires regular infusions of living human material, preferably young, presumably because of greater neuroplasticity and developmental potential. Without this feeding, it may not die, but it might return to dormancy. In November 2004, Michael implemented the first phase of his plan, installing hidden cameras around the property perimeter to identify Carter and any other potential procurers working for the entity. Within weeks, he had documented 6 different individuals exhibiting behavior patterns similar to Carter's, all watching the property from a distance, all seeming to communicate with it through gestures and what appeared to be a form of ritual genuflection. On January 17, 2005, Michael Wade disappeared. His car was found abandoned near the Johnson property, its doors open, the engine still running. Inside, investigators found his research materials scattered across the seats, including photographs of Raymond Carter and the other suspected procurers, along with detailed maps of the property showing what Michael believed to be entry points to the underground expansion of the structure. The official investigation concluded that Michael had suffered a mental breakdown, potentially exacerbated by his family history of obsession with the site. The prevailing theory suggested he had wandered into the restricted area and fallen into one of the many abandoned oil bores that pockmarked the region. Despite an extensive search, no body was recovered. What the official report didn't mention was what searchers found at the property line: Michael's shoes placed neatly side by side, facing toward the center of the property, a fine coating of plaster-like dust surrounding them. Nor did it mention the new government team that arrived within hours of the disappearance report, cordoning off the area and excluding local authorities from the search. For 3 weeks, the Johnson property once again swarmed with federal personnel in hazardous material suits. Heavy equipment was brought in, operating day and night. Local residents reported the ground trembling, as if from small, localized earthquakes. At night, strange lights were visible above the property, and those living nearest complained of headaches and disturbing dreams in which children's voices called to them from within their walls. Then, as abruptly as they had arrived, the federal teams departed. The property was once again sealed, this time with more permanent-looking infrastructure. Concrete barriers topped with razor wire, surveillance cameras mounted on high poles, and signs warning of radiation and chemical contamination. A small monitoring station was established half a mile away, staffed continuously by personnel who rebuffed all attempts at casual conversation. In the absence of official information, rumors proliferated. Some claimed the government had finally destroyed whatever abomination existed on the Johnson property. Others insisted they had merely contained it more effectively. A few suggested darker possibilities, that the federal authorities had struck some kind of bargain with the entity, providing it with controlled feedings in exchange for access to its unique properties. The truth might have remained buried indefinitely if not for the actions of Dr. Eliza Chen, a geologist contracted by an environmental assessment firm to analyze soil samples from the region as part of a groundwater protection study. Her test borings, taken at regular intervals along a grid pattern covering several counties, revealed something remarkable and terrifying. The anomaly is not confined to the Johnson property, she reported to increasingly alarmed superiors. The soil composition changes we identified, the unusual calcium organic matrix, extend in a network pattern for miles beyond the containment perimeter. It's as if the entity has extended microscopic tendrils outward, following the path of least resistance through more porous soil layers. Further analysis revealed these extensions were not random but targeted, reaching toward population centers, particularly locations housing children, schools, playgrounds, family neighborhoods. Most disturbing was the evidence that these extensions were growing rapidly, advancing several inches per day. Whatever containment measures were implemented at the source have failed, Chen concluded, or more accurately, they were circumvented. The entity has adapted, becoming more diffuse and therefore more difficult to contain. Rather than growing as a solid structure, it's extending its influence through a network of microscopic filaments, like a fungal mycelium or a neural network. Chen's report, marked for internal use only, was leaked to the press in March 2006 by a whistleblower within her firm. The resulting media frenzy briefly focused national attention on the Johnson property and its mysterious history, though official statements continued to reference only chemical contamination from the abandoned oil drilling operation. Public pressure finally forced a more transparent governmental response. A joint task force of military personnel and scientific specialists descended on the region, implementing what they termed a decisive remediation strategy. The entire 80-acre Johnson property was excavated to a depth of 50 feet, the removed soil treated with a proprietary chemical compound before being incinerated at extremely high temperatures. The excavation revealed the full horror of what had developed beneath the surface, a sprawling organic mineral structure with unmistakable architectural features, its walls containing hundreds of human-shaped niches, many occupied by partially absorbed remains. Most disturbing were the sections that appeared to serve specialized functions, chambers where the calcification process seemed most active, channels that appeared to circulate fluid throughout the structure, and a central region dense with tissue that resembled neural matter. "It's not a house that contains people," observed the lead scientist in a classified report later leaked online. "It's an organism that incorporates human components, using our bodies, perhaps even our consciousness, as building blocks for its own development." The Johnsons didn't just seal their children in the walls, they literally fed them to the house, allowed them to be absorbed and integrated into its substance. The remediation appeared successful. After treatment and removal of all contaminated soil, ground-penetrating radar and other sensing technologies detected no further anomalies. The excavated area was filled with clean soil and capped with a thick layer of concrete. Monitoring wells were installed at regular intervals surrounding the property to detect any resurgence of the entity. For 15 years, those wells showed nothing unusual. The Johnson property remained government land, officially designated as a chemical disposal site and explicitly excluded from any future development. The monitoring station was eventually automated, its readings checked remotely by technicians, rotated frequently to prevent prolonged exposure to the area. Life in the surrounding communities gradually returned to normal. The Johnson horror once again receded into local folklore, referenced occasionally in ghost tours and regional history books, but no longer considered an active threat. Then, in December 2020, a family purchased a modest home in a new subdivision 22 miles from the Johnson property. The Morgans, Thomas, Sarah, and their infant daughter Emily, were attracted by the affordable price and rural setting. Having relocated from California, they had no knowledge of the region's history. Within weeks of moving in, Sarah began complaining of strange sounds within their walls, scratching, occasional whimpers, sometimes what sounded like faint singing. Initial inspections revealed nothing unusual, and the builder suggested it was simply the house settling or small animals that had found their way into the insulation. As the sounds persisted, Thomas took more drastic measures, removing sections of drywall to examine the interior of their home. What he found defied explanation: patches of wall material that didn't match the surrounding construction, with a texture resembling hardened plaster but flecked with what appeared to be organic matter. More disturbing was his discovery that these patches were warm to the touch and seemed to pulse slightly under sustained contact, as if responding to his presence. When he attempted to remove a sample for closer examination, the material resisted conventional tools, dulling drill bits and saw blades after minimal contact. In February 2021, the Morgans awoke to find their daughter's nursery walls coated with a fine plaster-like dust that had not been there the night before. The crib was empty. Despite an extensive police investigation and national media coverage of the disappearance, Emily Morgan was never found. Subsequent examination of the house revealed that the anomalous wall sections had expanded overnight, now incorporating what appeared to be small bones and fragments of cloth resembling Emily's pajamas. Most horrifying was the development of a child-sized niche in the nursery wall, its interior surface smooth and almost polished, as if prepared specifically to receive an occupant. Analysis of dust samples from the nursery confirmed what some had already feared. The material matched the unique calcium organic composition associated with the Johnson entity. Somehow, despite the containment and remediation efforts, it had survived, spreading unseen through the soil until it found a new home, new walls, and new children to seal within them. As authorities implemented emergency testing protocols throughout the region, they made a chilling discovery. Traces of the same material were appearing in homes across 3 counties, all built on land underlaid with the microscopic tendrils that had extended outward from the Johnson property years earlier. These tendrils, dormant since the remediation, appeared to be reactivating simultaneously, as if responding to some shared signal. In homes where the contamination was most advanced, residents reported hearing voices from their walls, children calling for parents, adults speaking soothingly about protection and safety, a chorus of whispers promising sanctuary from a corrupt world. Most disturbing were reports of these voices addressing residents by name, seemingly aware of their presence and activities. As federal authorities scrambled to implement a new containment strategy, local historians noted a grim pattern. The most severely affected homes belonged to families with young children, particularly newborns. It was as if the entity, having learned from its long history, was now targeting specifically those structures most likely to provide what it needed. The Johnson horror had not been destroyed or contained. It had merely adapted, becoming more patient, more diffuse, more insidious in its methods. What Thomas and Margaret Johnson had begun in 1878, sealing their children in walls to protect them from worldly corruption, had evolved into something far more terrifying, an entity that saw human walls and human children not as separate things, but as components of itself, waiting to be properly joined. And throughout the region, in nurseries and children's bedrooms, a fine dust was settling on furniture and toys. A dust that, under microscopic examination, appeared to be slowly, methodically remaking those rooms in its own image, preparing new walls to receive new children in an endless cycle of grotesque incorporation. In homes where the contamination was most advanced, parents reported hearing a woman's voice singing an old lullaby from somewhere inside the walls. The same few lines repeated in an endless loop. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. The walls will keep you, safe from the world. Sleep in the plaster, rest in the stone. The house always knows how to care for its own."